Hello, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us from around the globe for the launch of what we think will be one of the most important initiatives in the history of the Pulitzer Center. I'm John Sawyer. I'm the executive director at the Pulitzer Center. And as most of you may know, we're a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, but with staff across the world. And our mission is to raise awareness and promote engagement with the systemic issues that affect us all. Climate has been at the forefront of our work for years, most recently with our reporting and educational outreach on rainforest. One aspect of the climate crisis that has gotten far too little attention, in our view, is the connection between climate and work. We see a lot of reporting on climate extremes, on hurricanes and forest fires and sea level rise, but not nearly enough about the chronically high temperatures that are making work impossible in many parts of the world, or the drought conditions that are contributing to unprecedented levels of migration. With support from the Loudest Foundation, we began researching this topic last summer, interviewing experts in the field and assessing the media landscape and exploring ways to improve media coverage on the climate-labor nexus. Our work on this was led by Flora Pereira, our Rainforest Education and Outreach Director, originally from Brazil and now based in Portugal, with years of experience on climate issues and how to engage the public. She'll be presenting the conclusions of that preliminary research from last summer and fall, from the report we shared with all of you yesterday. And then we'll hear from the experts themselves in a conversation led by Christine Spolar. And we're very fortunate to have recruited Christine to lead the Climate Labor Initiative for us. She is a veteran foreign correspondent, and editor with stints as investigations editor at the Financial Times and London business editor for the New York Times and reporting for the Washington Post and many other outlets. But before turning to Christine and our expert panel, we'll hear first from Flora. And again, thank you all for joining us today. And this is all about launching our opportunity for reporting on this, and we are eager to see proposals and to work with all of you, all the journalists who are on this call. And those who are not journalists, I hope you'll reach out to the journalists you know and encourage them to participate in this initiative. And so with that, I'll turn it to Flora. Flora.
Thank you very much, John. I'll be sharing the screen. Perfect, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here today in this virtual conversation with Marielle, John, Dr. Fahana, Dr. Hook, and Dr. Phaedra. And I wanted to share that before launching your work environment initiative, we wanted to understand more about the correlation between climate and labor, identifying key intersectional issues, but also we wanted to have an accurate sense of how the media is currently covering the climate and labor nexus. We are starting this conversation today by presenting the results of the climate and labor media landscape. The work was carried out in a three-phase research. The first phase consisted of a qualitative in-depth interviews with 12 scientists and media experts on the issues, some of them present here today with us. The second part was a quantitative online survey with more than 140 media professionals from 32 countries, as you can see from the graphic. Finally, a digital research was carried out using audience analysis and digital mapping tools to measure news media coverage on the topic. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by highlighting the most pressing issue in the interconnection between climate and labor identified by the specialists and the media professionals interviewed. The most shared perspective is that the intersection of labor and climate is a question of vulnerability. People who have contributed least to climate change are suffering the impacts most intensely. Disproportionately, poor people, people of color, women, people living in slums and indigenous communities are also the ones with fewest resources to get away from and survive climate-induced disasters. In that end of the climate spectrum are also laborers, stuck in systems where the labor force is adversely affected by climate, and that is a story largely missed by the mainstream news media. Next, please. But let's jump to the main question here today. How is media covering this intersection? Well, the dynamic between climate change and labor is hardly explored or not told at all. Labor is seen as a second level issue, and the media is failing to unpack the climate impact on equity issues through the lens of labors. The attention index, as we can see on the graphic on the right, we use it for the digital mapping research, shows that only the term climate change reaches the level of daily occurrences in the English language news. Yet, it occupies no more than 2% of the total stories. When combined with labors, it occupies at its peak 0.005% of the total monetary stories and media. Next, please. The conversation, okay, great. The conversations online captured in a survey of 1,500 outlets shows that the main actors when it comes to the relationships among these keywords are world leaders, indicating journalists dedicated mostly to replicating stories, government programs, or speeches without adding local context. There is the impression of a silencing on the topic itself, but especially from the frontline laborers. Their voices are generally considered unheard. Could you change, please, the next? We tried to understand more on the reasons for these shortfalls. We asked journalists and experts what were the most common media mistakes in their view, beyond the simple absence of coverage. Some of the mistakes mentioned are inherent to overall contemporary state of journalism. Nevertheless, from inaccuracy to omission and from ad hoc to more systematic, media errors are an important note to address and hopefully correct in any climate communication initiative. Next. Widely mentioned was the whiplash journalism with episodic news coverage that quickly moves from one story to another, don't giving a chance to journalists or outlets to show the bigger pattern of climate change. Misrepresentation or lack of diverse voices and lack of the workers' voices themselves was also highlighted. Important is also the outdated framing of trade-offs between economic development and protecting the environment, present in media and fostered by interest in industries. It creates a false opposition, repelling key stakeholders such as workers themselves who feel threatened and fear losing their jobs. Global media was also mentioned as having a Nordic-centric, globally named, but Nordic in practice, and accused of having a strong domestic focus, only covering the global south in negative cases. Lastly, dystopian-owning framings were also cited. Fear raises awareness, but also paralyzes people. Next, please. The research carried out also helped us to map key opportunities for a media and journalistic approach in tackling the lack of coverage on labor and climate-related issues. The biggest opportunity is the sense of importance of the topic by journalists and the expert community. 85% of the interviewers rated the topic between very to extremely important to be covered by the media. And 94% were interested in further investigating the nexus. We also are experiencing an important moment in climate communication. Specialists mentioned that the public concern is at highest level as it has ever been. And that is a moment that must be seized by responsible journalism. Also, labor is a very tangible prism through which climate is experienced. At a fundamental level, journalism addressing climate and labor is stepping into something that relates directly to people everywhere and every day. And not less important, there is will on part of the consumers and governments not to depend on exploited works. Production of the goods they consume, however, is out of sight and mind. There is a need to make process, trade flows, and supply chains more visible to consumers, and the media can be a key player in this change. Last. Finally, we mapped suggestions of quick procedures to a successful media approach that aims beyond exploring the climate and labor nexus so as to broaden the reach and impact of journalism itself. From many inputs we received, I would like to highlight the following today. Climate justice frame and focus is a need. Solutions for sustainability have to go through justice. If it does not, we will see the pattern of unsustainable economic transformations repeated. Support the combination of ambitious regional and local and international journalism on the climate and labor nexus and foster collaboration between them. Social movements matter. Effective climate change and labor communication needs to take this into account and work closely with this sector in a two-way road, bringing and hearing the key leaders and voice in the reporting process, but also by interacting, making information available and taking the produced coverage to these movements so they can strategically use good quality information in their advocacy process. And most importantly, change of narrative is a collective process that needs to involve and foster collaboration among multiple actors, global, local media, networks, educational partners, social movements, and above all, the front lines communities. Thank you very much, and I'm back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you, John, and thank you, Flora. My name's Christine Spoler, and I am the Climate Labor Editor at the Pulitzer Center. And that means I basically oversee this new initiative, Your Work Environment. I've been a journalist for over 30 years in newspapers and TV, and I've been a foreign correspondent, and I live in London. So the time zones, we're connecting here. It's my pleasure today to introduce some of the people who contributed to the report that you've just heard. All are recognized experts in climate change and research. I want to make certain that we're all here. I see. Okay, I will start with a little bit of a change. We'll start with Phaedra Pizzulo, the Associate Professor at University of Colorado, Boulder, in the College of Media, Communication, and Information. She was recently awarded the Christine Oravets Award in Environmental Communication. Her research focuses on the mobilization of resistance to toxic pollution, the communication of resilience in what she calls the late age of fossil fuels, and the advocacy of environmental and social justice. And she explores the broad inequities evident as the climate is changing. Mariela Ramirez is a communicator with Media Ninja in Brazil. The Ninja Network is a decentralized effort to produce and distribute information. It arose among people who were working for years in the free media sector in Brazil, from fanzines to the blogosphere, and they formed a network that now spans more than 150 cities. They've been developing technologies and communication ways and content for 7 years. Ninja creates an alternative media outlet throughout Brazil. It tracks issues that are omitted or missed by the traditional media. And it sees an explicit connection with labor as the climate changes. Farhana Sultana is an associate professor of geography and environment at Syracuse University. Her expertise is in climate justice, water governance, political ecology, and feminist scholarship. Prior to joining Syracuse, she taught at King's College in London and worked at the UN Development Program, which you might know as UNDP, since we all read the reports. Among her books, Water Politics, Governance, Justice, and the Right to Water, and also Eating, Drinking, Surviving. So I want to thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure learning about all your research. I will start with, if that's okay, with Phaedra Pizzulo. And you have talked about the broad inequities evident as the climate changes. So I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine, and to the Pulitzer Center. I'm honored to be speaking with these amazing panelists today and it is only by fiat that I am speaking first. Hopefully, we will have another one of our colleagues joining us soon, because certainly one of the best parts of the research the Pulitzer Center has done is amplifying voices from the Global South. And so my apologies for being the first one to speak. But of course, in the US, we have a lot of accountability for consumption and for inequity and for racial privilege that is important to this conversation. Some have argued that every story is a climate story, and I would add that every climate story is a labor story. Writing about labor and climate requires focusing on who and not just what. Climate reporting began as technical reporting, focusing on scientists, parts per million, and Celsius degrees. All the people who are moved by those stories, I would argue, have read them already. Now we need everybody else to care and to remember how we came to this unsustainable conjuncture pivots not only on fossil fuels and throwaway culture, but also in the belief that some people are disposable. Stories of climate and labor amplify the voices of frontline workers from the Global South and what sociologist David Nagupello calls the Global South of the North. The Global North of the South. This can be a hard story to pitch sometimes because climate tends to be long, complicated news, and corporate newsrooms tend to center or cater to elites. But these are the climate stories that are at the heart of how the world works, pun intended. Consider, for example, how last month the UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, made a global commitment to create a global plastics treaty. And for the first time in UN history, the testimony and perspective of waste pickers were included. There are over 20 million waste pickers in the world, but their voices remain marginalized in most public debates over policies. Plastics are a climate story because plastics are made from fossil fuels and have increased like no other commodity in the past century because they are part of the fossil fuels industry of plan B for how to make profits. Plastics also are a labor story because there's no recycling in the world without waste pickers. Only 9% of plastics ever made have been recycled, and those that have been reused have found their way through the labor of waste pickers. Stories of workers are not only newsworthy because of their magnitude, but also of their impact. Stories of climate labor can move policy. Consider, for example, the 2016 Chinese documentary, Plastic China, directed by Juling Wang, which features plastic waste workers. Although the Chinese government banned the film, the next year they announced a plastic import ban on foreign waste called the National Sword Policy. This policy in 2017 forced leading global waste plastic producers to have to grapple with what to do with plastic waste and provided leadership for countries to resist the constant flow of waste from the global north to the global south. It was monumental for the United States, as China used to receive approximately 70% of all US plastic waste. So of course, the film was not the only reason this policy occurred, but documenting their lives and sharing their stories, creating a global embarrassment, a global spotlight on the burden that was disproportionately placed on everyday people in China definitely shaped public perception in China. I was teaching there the year after that came out, and then globally. Stories of climate labor also can lead to impacts in courts. Consider the amazing victory of Diane Wilson in Houston, Texas, US against Formosa Plastics, in which the courts awarded her $50 million settlement, which is the largest in US history, involving a private citizen's lawsuit against an industrial polluter. Her key evidence came not only from collecting microplastics in the water, but also interviewing whistleblowers who worked at the plant. Laborers are making a difference when those in significant decision-making positions listen to them. As the grassroots NGO Movement Generation and our Power campaign have outlined, a just transition framework resists, rethinks, and restructures. A just transition involves imagining a shift from an extractive economy, including consumerism, a colonial mindset, exploitation, enclosure of wealth and power, militarism, to a living economy, including caring and sacredness, regeneration, cooperation, ecological and social well-being, and deep democracy. The extractivist economy includes not only fossil fuel workers, like I would say the overused trope of the middle-aged white male coal worker and waste pickers, but also sex workers at fossil fuel sites, first responders to fires, pandemics, floods, and other disasters, which in my country includes prison labor, and all the industries that are essential to throwaway culture, fast fashion, fast food, and so on and so forth. Labor and climate also implicates renewable work, as the jobs versus environment frame, as Flora pointed out, is outdated and a myth. This labor includes not only renewable energy jobs, but also care work, outdoor recreation, and farm workers. They also might include stories of life beyond work, like Buen Vivir. At the last COP and at the UNEP meeting, NGOs like the Just Transition Alliance have brought workers together to exchange insights. These conversations are worth following for positive and inspiring stories. Historian Dipesh Chakrabarty claims the climate crisis is a crisis of imagination. As many have pointed out, we have far more popular stories about disasters than we do about life beyond capitalism. Stories of transition should be identified and shared, such as locally, we have one where there was a mining town that shut down the mine, and one of the former miners who lost his job made the community into an extreme sport destination site. We don't have stories. For thousands of years, communities have shifted their economies and their focus. And we need more stories about positive examples of when workers themselves reimagined how to have a robust economy somewhere. In closing, I want to turn to how journalists might cover these stories, because none of this matters if your readers or the listeners aren't there. I can't emphasize enough the takeaways on page 39 to 42 of the media report that the Pulitzer Center has put together, including the need for solid capacity building, media support, and education structure. Messaging needs to be nuanced, as Flora said, avoiding the one-size-fits-all approach. It is important to think strategically about how to build distinct messages of work with a variety of audiences for a variety of different audiences. As you know, probably if you're in the world of journalism, we're shifting back from a predominantly print culture to an oral communication culture in many ways. You can see this, for example, in the proliferation of podcasts in the past 5 years alone. When possible, if you can imagine your stories across media, you'll be able to reach a wider audience if you think through questions of how can your print story be shared in relationship to a podcast or through digital storytelling. How can you decide what to share in short form and then have long form content for those more invested, including classrooms and NGOs? Could you enlist interns globally affiliated with universities? And this is one of the great strengths of the Pulitzer Center, right? Like Fudan in Shanghai or University of Nairobi, to help translate stories into videos or to share resources with hashtags to increase traction in social media. I hope you'll take the time with your own labor to build networks to make your own job feel more sustainable as you're writing about other laborers making their work more sustainable. Thank you for your time today and for your care work of covering climate and labor globally.
Super. Thank you, Phaedra. That was fascinating. And it's very good. As you're talking about media, we're going to go right to Mariela, who can talk to us about how to adapt and how you adapted in Brazil when beyond traditional media. Thank you, Mariela.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi, my name is Marielle, as I was presented. I'm one of the co-founders of Media Ninja, and I'm here with Tani, my ninja's mate. And we are going to present you a little bit of our story. Is it okay? So Media Ninja is a major independent media of Brazil that operates in a decentralized network of communicators with thousands of collaborators from different Brazilian states. It dedicates part of its agenda to the journalistic coverage of the environmental and climate issues. To understand it further, I want to share the Out of Access Fora do Eixo's story, which is the network that originated Media Ninja. Out of Access is a cultural network that began in Cuiabá, Mato Grosso State in 2001, performing independent music festivals. In this context, we started with one collective, and in 5 years, we were more than 200 collectives connected into a network throughout Brazil. So in 2006, we formally funded Out of Access, working with a network policy based in a methodology marked by 3 pillars: artists, producers, and journalists, travels, cultural products distribution, and content production in good old be the media. In this way, we understand that people build collectives that connected networks, that build movements. In 2011, we moved to the biggest city of South America, São Paulo. And at that moment, the world was living a huge global spring. And on this outburst in 2013, we started a strong dialogue with journalists and collectives when we funded Media Ninja, which in Portuguese, its acronym stands for Independent Narratives of Journalism and Action. Our proposal was to create a media that told stories from the perspective of people who are struggling and social movements, using low resolution and high fidelity, from mosaics of partialities, as we call. Today, how we covered and emergent from the big demonstrations that marked Brazil in that same 2013, and that in the next year, we kept strongly covering the intense and volatile political national agenda, reaching today almost 10 million followers in our social media and building up what we call today the activist forest. Activist Forest is a set of editorials from the Media Ninja Big Display that takes the audience to know stories from different thematic areas. An example of it is the Amazon Ninja's House, an editorial that covers the environmental, indigenous, and climate agenda, and which was built from a journey of several years of coverage, such as coverage of indigenous lands that are threatened by the cattle and agribusiness, or the documentary about evils caused by the mining activity in Brazil. Besides the coverage of environmental defenders murdered, once that Brazil occupies the 4th place in the ranking of murders of this type in the world. We can also mention recent climate crimes coverage, such as Rio Doce Basin ecocide provoked by Samarco in 2015, and the Vale crime in Brumadinho in 2019, which killed more than 200 people in the biggest labor crime of Brazil. Recently, we've made the trilingual coverage of the COP26 that involved 471 journalists, media activists, and activists from more than 10 countries. These people produced together text, photos, video, and podcast contents in a totally collaborative way. The result is that this coverage reached more than 14 million people in social media of Media Ninja and Amazon Ninja's House throughout the conference. For us, the most important aspect of the storytelling is connecting voices to make their struggle visible. And the main voices we bring to the climate discussion are the people who are struggling in the territories. In addition to living, these people produce and articulate fundamental data and researches about the reality of the forest and the climate issues. And they do more. They have the praxis of these realities. Finally, there's a gap in the media coverage and a vast field to be explored in regard to the climate in labor areas. There's a whole set of social and labor movements that still do not dialogue with the global climate justice agenda. And some of these people are and will be the most affected by the climate crisis in the forest and cities. This movement have a relevant role in the conquest of rights in regard to this debate. Therefore, there's a huge potential for possible exchanges in this field. Thank you, people.
Thank you. A great presentation. Thank you very much. And now we will go to Farhana Sultana. And I think following that, you are an expert on water governance and some of the disasters that Mariella was showing. I would like to see how you think about where the media is not covering this kind of issue, governance, rather than disaster. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christine. And hello and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you to the Pulitzer Center for inviting me to speak with you today. I want to discuss three themes related to climate and labor that I think are issues that journalists and writers can pay attention to or heed more in order to have more robust reporting. And then I'm happy to turn to issues that Christine just raised. So I draw from many years of work and research on issues around climate justice, water governance, resource management, international development, and inequities produced by intersecting processes in an increasingly globalizing world. So the issues that I want to highlight are also important in relation to the latest IPCC report that was released last month and the COP26 from last year. Some of these issues came up, but I just want to touch upon them to draw your attention to them. So the first point is a recognition that climate change is effectively a water issue. And I've been studying this connection for over 2 decades now. And when you think about it, climate change is essentially water change, right? Too much, too little, wrong time, wrong place, wrong quality. So whether we think about floods or droughts or water contamination or salinization or rising seas, there's a water component to it. And because humans rely entirely on water, like other species, for our reproduction as physical embodied cells, but also for our society to work, for our political structures, for our cultural sense of self, for ecological systems that we rely on. So when we think about the importance and centrality of water, we can start to see how climate and labor are linked through water across sectors. This is because water security is linked to so many sectors such as agricultural production, industrial production, the functioning of geopolitical relationships over, let's say, transboundary rivers, aquifer management, so therefore city and municipal services. So a whole lot of ways that things that we take for granted are entirely relying on a water system on Earth. But the labor related to managing water or how we envision water is intersectionally gendered and classed and racialized. So when you think about what's happening around the world with increasing drought or water insecurity induced by climate change, we're seeing that it impacts women and girls more because they're spending more labor hours fetching water. But it also impacts men, but particularly poor men who are laboring on the farms, but also poor women who are laboring on the farms in the agricultural sector. So across the world in agrarian communities, we're seeing that different types of labor relationships are being altered through the reliance on water because of climate change. So when we think about water and sanitation that is likely to worsen, and people working from across sectors such as agriculture, industry, but also service, we're going to also see the ways that water comes to affect very basic things such as our survival for drinking water, and then how that then affects what we know as social reproductive labor or social reproduction in the home and in caregiving. So things such as bathing and cooking and sanitation and hygiene, again, these are entirely labor questions, but they're very gendered and classed intersectional labor questions. So the way we think about those issues, we need to think about the functioning of families and fields and factories and so on. So once we start to make those connections, we can see how water ends up opening up new possibilities to explore climate and labor linkages. So a second point I want to raise is the labor for climate adaptation. So adaptation to climate change requires labor across different stages to address issues such as rising vulnerabilities and marginalizations from climate-induced impacts such as sea level rise or flooding or wildfires and so on. So the goal of climate adaptation in any country or city is to increase people's abilities to cope with and adapt to climate change or changing climates in their locality, and have options to live and have livelihood survival strategies in place where people can actually live where they live instead of being pushed to migrate. So we're increasingly seeing talk about labor for climate mitigation, such as the just energy transition. But when we think about climate adaptation, that has largely occurred across the global south, because that's where climate impacts and stresses have been felt for much longer. So who is doing this adaptive labor? And how is their time and effort valued or compensated? This is not always evident, because climate adaptation labor is often assumed to be voluntary or in the name of the communal good or the public good. But this is, again, incredibly intersectionally classed, gendered, and racialized in terms of whose labor is being called upon and what labor compensations are being made, but what other types of labor are being disrupted in the process of, let's say, building embankments, putting in solar pumps, or digging ditches and dikes for irrigation and flood control. So when we think about these issues, that is a labor story in terms of who's toiling to make climate adaptation occur for a wider group of people. But when we think about the ways that these kinds of climate adaptation projects and programs also create opportunities for new forms of labor to emerge, for instance, new types of farming or fishing practices, we can also therefore look at how labor relations are shifting in different localities. So in the place where people live, but then also if people are no longer able to eke out livelihoods, if they're pushed to migrate, which is often in their home countries, people rarely cross international borders as climate migrants because of the expense and a host of issues related, we can start to see labor shifts that occur because of the movement of people from one region to another in their host country, and how therefore climate impacts wider political economy of production and reproduction within different landscapes. So are people being displaced to the city, and are cities' labor forces shifting because they're absorbing greater number of climate migrants? A third point I want to raise is basically, I just want to conclude with the labor of climate expertise, right? So in terms of who are the experts and the expertise who the media and journalists and writers contact, or whose expertise or knowledge is valued for climate commentary or climate communication. So when we think about the labor of expertise, we start to see that it is often the same types of people. It is often men. It is often people from the global north. It is often people who are white. These are the climate experts who are often called upon to give commentary or give a quote to be cited in a piece or in a documentary or in a live media reel. So when we think about why this matters, it matters because who is heard, whose voice counts, influences which kinds of narratives and epistemologies travel, and what that does to public discourse and wider public knowledge about climate change. So if we think about diversifying experts and the labor of expertise on climate, we can start to see how stories are framed and what issues get highlighted and the connections that are made and so on. So increasing the inclusivity of expert labor and the input to climate journalism are really important aspects in that labor and climate connection, in my opinion. So for instance, an article recently highlighted how expert labor in climate is often tapped from similar sources, but perhaps journalists can think about decolonizing their approaches to which knowledge and whose knowledge is engaged instead, because that creates more creative and generative stories from around the world. And we're able to expand the types of voices and types of wisdom that we start to value in understanding climate change in a much more complex way. And it's also an equity issue because we therefore start to see climate from a different range of perspectives. So thank you for listening, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to be contacted. You can certainly learn more about my work and my research. You can access my publications from my website, which is literally my name. It's farhanasultana.com. And I'll end with the question that Christine posed. I believe it was in terms of governance or coverage of disasters, right? So that's really true, that in the sense that often the immediate media needs to be on disasters because the disaster is unfolding. People need to understand issues around risk and rehabilitation and disaster relief, disaster recovery and rebuild. But at the same time, what are the ways we can think about those issues and not just sensationalized ways, and not just temporally, not just time bound. I completely appreciate the pressure that our journalist colleagues and writers are under in terms of deadlines, in terms of getting readers to pages, to subscriptions and so on. But we can also think about tracing different types of disasters related to climate or water and so on, because these are governance issues, right? What happens afterwards? What is happening in terms of what opportunities rose or didn't? What was foreclosed or curtailed, or rather what was generated? So in what ways can we perhaps trace specific groups or organizations or movements, but perhaps even think about in terms of changing labor relations because of a specific disaster that came through and absolutely destroyed the opportunity to have economic livelihood, or to rebuild homes, or to have viable farming communities, or to have waterways that provide fisheries or ecosystem services, or enough for a city or a small town or city to sustain itself. But it's also an infrastructure issue, right? But widely, when we think about governance as that umbrella under which a host of managerial decisions, political decisions, and commitments are made, we can start to have these conversations about tracing the opportunities, or rather the foreclosures that arise after disasters take place, in terms of what forms of attention is given, what issues are not being told, what are the issues that need to be highlighted. And this links to the third point I made in terms of who you ask influences the stories you tell. I'll end with that.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that Salim Ul-Huq is not here. He's the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. And when we talk about differences between global North and global South, we really wish he was here right now, because Bangladesh is just so advanced in how some of its reporting has been, and so informed. But I do know that Professor Huq was the lead author of the chapter of the last, the IPCC's fourth assessment report, which is adaptation and mitigation. And one of his thoughts is that journalists need to be thinking how to cover climate change like economics, like an everyday consideration of life, and that makes stronger connections between the disasters that Farhana was talking about and climate itself, and that the debate between global North and global South on loss and damage considerations is very important. And that is really part of the most acute problem that people need to address in the reporting right now. There's a dire finding in the latest IPCC report, I'm sorry. Heat is rising so that the human body cannot manage. McKinsey just did a report, I believe in the last year, like, can India survive its heat? You know, heat and health problems translate into significant loss of labor and jobs. And especially what Farhana was talking about, water is an issue because water dehydration on the job might seem like a smaller issue, but it's a very big issue for the workers and for renal damage and health damage and national health insurance costs. It's an economic problem. And that's part of my interest, coming over from a business perspective on what reporters could be doing. I want to emphasize that a lot of the stories that I think all of you were talking about are explanatory journalism. It can be investigative, that's great, but simply explaining to people where there's so much in today's news cycle about what and how they can absorb this information is really important. I think we all know that the stress of trying to follow any news story, even Ukraine right now, there's an overload of information. So I think Flora's report helps us slow down, think about what the issues are. And I think all of what you were saying today is how can you help reporters slow down and frame these issues in a way that are impactful and memorable? So I thank you, everybody, for your presentations today. So, John, do you want to go to the questions? I haven't gone over to see them. How would you like to do that?
Yeah, we can bring some of that in, and for those of you who may have just joined in the middle of this, the Q&A button at the bottom is the place to add questions, and this is a chance to put questions to any of the panelists, to us, and I hope you'll do so. We have a note from Bhumika Saraswati, from an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker from India, member of the Dalit community, marginalized community in India, working on a story about how climate change is directly leading to sex trafficking of women. And it's hard because it's a long story. It's hard to tell. Also, Bhumika makes the point that she's making short documentary films. And what do we think about the visual media? That it's hard to get funding to support for that. But in her view, it reaches more people. So I think this goes back maybe to Phaedra, your point about thinking about podcasts and different media. Maybe you could speak to that, sort of looking at, certainly, as you know, Bhumika, I think from our site, we have supported a number of video projects, and we're quite open to that. The trick for us is finding an outlet, finding some placement that will help get the traffic that you mentioned. But Phaedra, perhaps you could add to that.
I'm happy to add to that. Of course, Marielle and Thani are the experts because they're doing it. And if people weren't just so excited looking at their visuals and hearing how amazing they've been at doing this work. So please, if you two don't mind following up, but I would agree. I'm so glad you're doing that work. I'm so glad you're covering that story. And I do think that's one of the greatest challenges, not just with the content flood that Christine mentioned that we're facing, but also with our soundbite culture, right? Where we're starting to say, oh, this is a 2-minute read. This is a 1-minute read, right? Which we couldn't even 20 years ago, we would have been like, what? Why are you writing that at the beginning of a news story? So I do think, and I'm sure you're already doing this work from your question, but please feel welcome to follow up if those of us on the panel don't address what you're thinking of in particular. But this is why multimedia platforms are essential to journalism today. We have to convince the corporations that are publishing journalist stories, and also individual journalists have to today take on multiple social media platforms. And you find the most successful people, like my fellow panelists, are doing that labor, and it all feeds into each other, and it creates a conversation that reaches different lengths, because you have to have sound bites. You have to have only people who will read, that can't listen to the videos, people who can capture sound, people who are invested in the visuals. Their presentation was so amazing. I felt so silly once I saw yours because I didn't bring visuals. So yes, breaking that down and knowing that you need a short form, you need a long form, and you need multimedia formats. But could my fellow panelists speak to this, because you do the work?
Well, I can speak a little bit in that when I was at the Financial Times, I was the investigations editor. I only had so much money, and I was very happy to get Pulitzer money. I too have been a grantee, but I also knew to slice and dice. If we did an investigation, a month afterwards, I'd say, like, could could we write a script from this from this investigation and create a podcast, which we did. So, and it was also very important, we realized, to have GIFs or different kinds of discussion that you could put out on Twitter or put out Facebook. Twitter Space is very interesting right now. I've learned a lot by discussions on Twitter Space, and that's a new format for me. So yeah, I think you have to think about how people can digest. I also had a very interesting conversation, though, with a researcher in Greece who had been looking at workers in Qatar and finding that, in fact, they get their news from TV broadcasts. So, some traditional, more so than their phone. They use their phone more for more utility than for news. So, it just depends, I think, on the kind of worker, and also how do we reach different people. Mariella probably has, 10 rabbits in her hat trying to figure out how to get to different audiences.
Yes, I think that, of course, the method, of course, the technique is very important. I think, but the internet brought us something that is very important. It's like how to work together with a lot of people, to think together different process. For us, we always want to share a little bit the story about our access, because it was the way that we began. It's what the way that we are now Media Ninja, because we started in small cities of Brazil, in a very different context of the biggest cities, for example, as we are today. And it was very difficult to work in that time, because, of course, the different cities, agribusiness cities, for example, they are focused on a pattern of way of life, and we are doing different things. But we started doing together a process in a collaborative way, and it was a difference. When we understood that, we got the technique and we started thinking the other different ways of spreading, for example, stories, and use, for example, by using telephones and by using mobiles. But the way we did it is the difference for us, yes? The way that we struggled doing that. And of course, the people who we connected during the process, the social movement, the people who are struggling, because they know that the resilience of the process are very important. So for us, values that we brought to the conversation, to this process, were the main difference of we were doing, yes? Because cards, because multimedia, language, everybody's doing, yes, but how to connect more people, how to create new process, because the world is changing every day, very rapidly, very fast. And for us, the way of getting in this speedy is being together with a network of people.
Marielle, thank you for that. And just what your point about struggle and covering it. There's a good question in the chat from Daniela Lerda, also from Brazil, the Brazil representative for Neotero. And she asked, could the speakers explore a bit more the apparent contradiction between raising more plural narratives, different voices and perspectives, which are often about impact and struggle, with the recommendation of doing more positive framed stories that provide solutions and alternative pathways, help us to imagine that a different world is possible. That's a tension we feel all the time about. People, they look at the news and if they think it's all negative, they despair. Well, they want to say, what can I do? And so they want solutions, but often it feels, we think that as journalists, our greatest strength is in sort of describing what the problem is, and we may not be quite as good at doing solutions. But how do the experts on this call, what do you think about that, and what advice do you have for journalists as how we bridge that divide?
Maybe Farhana wants to respond to that one, I think would be the key speaker. But I just want to say, this is one of the greatest mistakes I see in stories on climate and labor, is that they think that the Global South is only the story of negative harm and problems. and that the solutions aren't with the same people. So as Professor Sultana was saying before, oftentimes the experts are white cis males in the global north who come up with global tech solutions, even though that's the same identity that got us into this unsustainable conjuncture in the first place. And so the idea that the solutions are not lying with these communities. So Professor Sultana, can you elaborate? Because I think that was part of your point in your statement.
Yes, thank you, Phaedra. So I think I'll touch upon this very briefly. I mean, there are far greater experts to this, and I know that Flora wants to comment also, drawing from the report, but I'll just quickly mention a couple of points that related to the question as it was posed. That it is true that often if you cover or engage local voices, you will hear stories of struggle, because that's what's happening, right? Climate stories are often stories of struggle. But in terms of what's happening, how stories are framed, so I completely agree with Phaedra in terms of we see, for instance, the co-optation by the fossil fuel industry in greenwashing narratives, in co-opting climate justice talk, without much clarity on the fact that climate justice is praxis-based, is very rooted in communities. It does come from sites of struggle and movements or collective action based on struggle, but these are also sites where people are celebrating resistance, celebrating living, celebrating the fact that there's continuity, intergenerational continuity, right? People, and celebrating refusal. They're refusing to do certain things. So when we think about the different ways we can frame it, so yes, we should actually acknowledge suffering. We can't just completely ignore that, right? Because that would be a different form of pathology. So yes, you should acknowledge it. You have to be true and brave on that. But at the same time, you can also look at agency. That within structural constraints, where is agency? Where is creativity? What are the ways that people, the very fact that they're here, how are they still here? In what ways have they lived in capacious lives in different cosmologies and different forms of relationships? So if you think about, for instance, indigenous communities around the world, their cosmology of nature as kin, like kinship relations. So in what ways does that help people overcome different forms of apocalypse, of colonialism, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and so on? So yes, we shouldn't deny the different forms of harm, because that would be completely irresponsible, right? But at the same time, you can also elevate different forms of creativity and conviviality and different forms of collectivizing, whether it's small kitchen gardens or communities coming together in caregiving networks, or in terms of mutual aid, right? There are different forms of labor relations. Once you expand the labor, understanding of labor beyond just productive labor in the economy or in the shop floor or an industry or in an office, right? Labor is much more expansive. It's what we do every single day to survive. So I think in many ways, we can start to think about the positive pathways that have been historically present, but look at their spatial connection. So this is the argument I'm making as somebody who is from the global South and is very particularly mindful of that geopolitics of knowledge production and knowledge circulation, that how do we tell these stories? So yes, let's not pathologize people, but also let's not fetishize their positive creativity, right? People are working hard to survive. There's great inequality and injustice in the world, but at the same time, we can help elevate certain voices. Like if their story of suffering also contains stories of hope, stories of collectivizing, stories of resistance, stories of rebuilding. Those are important parts of both aspects to the story that need to be captured. So we don't neither pathologize nor fetishize. That's been something I always teach my students.
Can I compliment? Just a little bit, because I agree a lot with Farhana. And for us, when Bolsonaro got the last elections, we started thinking about, we need to show short victories, small victories, sorry. Yes, because it's not a period of great victories. So we started like showing the small victory of the people and movement that were struggling. Yes, and we aim to stimulate these people who are there, because they needed to continue believing that it's possible to change things, change the reality, yes, to face the crisis, the profound crisis that we are living. So for us, we got doing that and showing the resistance and strengthening the call to action to resist and to face these hard times here in Brazil. And to close, the indigenous people always say that the different times demand different strategies. So for us, it's like this.
Now, I was quickly gonna add that this is a very important question, and it has been coming up a lot in the climate narrative discussion. And what I've seen is that if before 5 years ago, the discourse was this dystopian discourse about climate where people feel powerless and paralyzed, 2 years ago or maybe less, we have this discussion that maybe we need to talk about positive stories and etc. But doing the research was the first time where there was a consensus that was neither one or other, but that people in their day-to-day life, they are motivated sometimes by fear, sometimes by positive. So to replicate that in the narrative as well, to replicate that in the system, that sometimes it can be a very dystopian narrative that will motivate you to action. And sometimes it can be also, you need some inspiration to keep going. So it's more about the balancing than the dystopian only. And also it's very aligned with a new movement that I've been seeing, that is the post-dystopian climate movement, that it is about accepting there is cause ahead, embracing these calls, but not paralyzing. So very connected what Marielle shared, that is, believe that your small actions or day-to-day actions are very important, and keeping doing that actions, because I think also the dystopian makes us feel very small regarding how huge is the climate crisis. But that narrative is the one that not working, understanding that it's in our day-to-day life, so we can also make changes and choices in our day-to-day life, is about of what this post-dystopian climate has been discussing. How can we not lose hope and keep walking or keep waking up in the morning a bit hopeful?
If I could just add one more thing, Flora, then this again is, I think, trying to channel Salim al-Hoque, who I know in our conversations with us, he has been very forceful in saying that Bangladesh knows way more than the average reader or even policymaker in the global north knows about what climate reality is and what adaptation is, what they're doing about it. And he expresses significant amount of frustration or lack of being impressed with sort of northern experts coming down to sort of dictate what should be done, that we need to be much more focused on what we can learn from what countries, societies on the front lines are already doing. And I think we hope that's an opportunity in this reporting initiative that we're launching today, is to get out and do that kind of reporting. And out of that, I think you'll get some things that are solution-oriented, positive-oriented, and you'll also be talking about the struggles that people are having, but you'll be doing it in concert with people who are truly expert and closest to this issue.
There is a question from Mirna Bonin asking, are there any panelists or any of the panelists aware of comparable citizen journalist networks in the United States? This
would be something similar to Media Ninja. Is that what? Probably.
That's what I take the question to.
What do you think, Marielle? Are you aware of things like that here?
I think not as us. Like as we work, but yeah, there are some medias that work in a different way. I think that what we did, for example, we began with collective houses, with different, we didn't meet it yet in other countries. And I don't know, I was thinking about what you said also, John, about the solutions, yes, how to show that. And when we talk about the global South, I think that we need to to remember that there are a lot of solutions also here, because always when you think about Global South, we think that they will be the most affected people. For example, when we are talking about the climate crisis. And yeah, there are a lot of people working here that are struggling, but that are creating solutions, because they live in hard times and with in their territories facing so many threats. And to survive, they need to create, they need to be creative. So I think that Media Ninja is part of this process, this historical process. In a country like Brazil, that is very marked by racism and slavery. And we needed to create something different to survive. Because if you want to work, for example, in a cultural scenario with culture in Brazil, you need to be creative, yes, because there's no money. And it's so difficult in our cities. Yeah, I'm from Cuiabá. It's a city in the center of Brazil, and it's a medium city, and there's no money to work, for example, in culture. So we needed like to be creative, to create like a solidarity coins and a different process. Yes. So I think like we need like to show that the global South, they will be the most affected, but we are also creating, we are also struggling. Yes. Solutions for this crisis and for this moment that the world live.
We had an interesting question or comment in the chat from Ilona Ross, who is in the Hudson Valley of New York, ex-Associated Press journalist, describes herself as an angry old lady now, activist on environmental issues, and she raises the question. She said, "Look, so wait a second. I'm in the North. Isn't it possible that we're going to get hit as badly as the South? It's just a matter of time." And she said, "Is it possible that our greater wealth is masking the problem, but that we're next on the chopping block?" And it raises the question of how do we make these connections? And we've been doing over the last several years at the Pulitzer Center an initiative called Connected Coastlines. And that's about trying to raise the level of science reporting on climate in regional outlets all up and down the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the Pacific. We've done, I think, 40 or so of these projects. And we're trying to reach people who may be politically more conservative and help them to see what the connections are. There are people that are actually within the United States, are on the front line, and they're seeing things like sea level rise and all the associated factors related to that. How do we? And I'm just asking the panelists here. How do you see us making those kinds of connections between North and South in a way that reaches everybody, engages them?
I could start because my house was evacuated last weekend due to a fire that's right next to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is one of the top, if not the top, international research center on climate change in the world. And it was under threat from a fire this past weekend. We also had in our community 2 months ago, 1,000 people lose their homes in an urban setting due to wildfire. And one of the contributing factors certainly was climate. If you know anything about where I'm from, you also know that we are the epitome of a white, privileged, economically privileged global North community. And so this question from the Hudson Valley has come up here a lot for those of us that do climate justice work, because obviously people here are truly traumatized by losing their entire homes. And in very real, visceral ways, we are already facing climate disaster. And my encouragement, and I hope some of my fellow panelists will pick it up, is that we recognize that there are some communities who have been dealing with this for decades. And my indigenous colleagues would say they've been dealing with it in the United States since 1492, that the first climate change was not atmospheric, but was white settler colonialism coming and making them move to places where they were not living and having to deal with an entirely different ecology and ecosystem to survive. And so we only harm ourselves when we try to privilege one group over another as saying, oh, well, we just experienced this fire this past weekend. Of course, it received global attention. Of course, seeing a fire next to the National Center of Atmospheric Research is an iconic photojournalist image that should be circulated, right? At the same time, that same center has brought in Indigenous experts from around the world who have helped them figure out from their intergenerational knowledge where ice was melting and places to study that go beyond the data of their supercomputers, because that traditional knowledge of people who know the land and know the ice and know the water have been dealing with this for generations. So it's an opportunity for us to learn, and learning is not an insult. We should all be able to learn from each other. And the idea that there are some that feel like they cannot learn because they've lived through trauma is something we need to examine ourselves. I just felt like we had a timely topic here, but I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to respond to that.
I can take it on, but I do want to acknowledge that, yes, the question about things getting worse here is a question of time. It always has been, but it's also why there's been so much delay in climate mitigation, right? In terms of reducing greenhouse gas, in terms of thinking about that kind of endless capitalist growth model on a finite planet, which is unsustainable, which is how we got into this mess. That's largely because it's been displaced, right? It's been outside of the field of vision of very powerful people, across kind of Anglo-European or Anglo-Eurocentric knowledge and power production systems, and then also geopolitical control. Who controls the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, so the IMF, the WTO, when we think about these global infrastructures, and then when we think about climate debt that is owed to countries across the global south. So that is a time question. So yes, it was going to show up, but here it will show up unevenly. So, right, it's already been experienced by Native American and First Nation peoples, but also across Latin America, which is also colonized by Europeans. And then we can also think about in terms of like the way it's been racialized in African American communities, in communities of color with air quality issues around housing. So I always said that, climate justice is a gender justice question, but it's also a racial justice question. It's a housing justice question, and all of these issues. So if you look at it through these multiple lenses, you can actually do what is called, comparative reporting. So what John was mentioning about the connected coastlines, that is a comparative look through a certain particular set of lenses. So you can absolutely do that comparative look at how are different cities responding across different spaces, maybe within the same country. For instance, if you look at water, right? If you look at water in Flint, Michigan, is going to look very different from water in Manhattan, New York. Or if you look at issues around climate breakdown and impacts on infrastructure and resiliency and all of that, you can say, okay, what is happening in cities across the global south, the mega cities versus the large older cities in the global north, right? What are the different ways that governance mechanisms, funding allocation, political process, those are all labor questions, right? It's about budgetary allocation. Who's doing the political organizing? Who's doing the political asks or the resistance? Those are all labor questions, but we have to imagine labor in a wider way and then look at those connections across geographical spaces. But these are also connections internally that have to be historicized. So when you think about these kinds of connections across space and time and scale, which obviously me as a geographer, I'm going to highlight because that's what we do. We think simultaneously across spaces and times and scales to look at those interconnections and those complexities, because that enables you to tell a much more not only robust stories, but much more creative stories that can also showcase what we're missing when we're not doing that kind of analysis. So it's informative, but it's also hopeful in the form that hope is an action verb. It requires disciplining. If you want to have climate hope, you need to act. You need to do something. You need to educate yourself. You need to get involved. You need to do something, because sitting there and wallowing is not going to help. So I'll end with that.
We had another question from related to something we haven't touched on yet from Selena Greco, she's a PhD student at York University in Canada. in education, but interested in researching science and climate change education. And her question was, the kinds of things we're talking about today, how do we fit that into the educational context? How do we incorporate that in our teaching and in the relationships with, we have 35 or so university partners, mostly in the US so far. We're trying to build that out globally, where we bring journalists on campus, and we have reporting fellowships for students, and including a number of opportunities related specifically to climate. But this is something that I know Farhana and Vader, you're both dealing with, and maybe you can speak to how it looks from your perspective on campuses.
All right. Okay. I'll take a stab at this. Thank you for this question. If I understood it correctly, in terms of thinking about climate conversations, right, in educational context, and in terms of thinking about, I think there was a part of the question that was also looking at the lenses through feminism and care, right? If I understood that question. Well, teaching is an act of care, right? It is labor, but it is also an intergenerational care network. So that's one way to think about it. But increasingly, our students are very, very hungry for courses on climate justice. So I teach a course on climate justice that I'm having to teach almost every semester because of growing demand. I do a lot of public pedagogy on social media, and I give several talks in any given month in terms of that kind of information sharing, so that wider groups of people may be able to hear, even if it feels like I'm repeating myself, but different people haven't heard it the same way, right? And conversations always shift depending on who's in the audience, because it's a two-way street. So when you think about educational settings and how to teach with more empathy and with care, but then some of that also means care to the curriculum. Again, going back to my point in terms of which forms of knowledge is being included in the curriculum. What is valued. So in my climate justice course, students straight off the bat have to read about indigenous philosophy, about feminist theory, about racial justice, about issues around geopolitics and international globalization and the governance systems, because those are sites of inequities. But if you don't understand an injustice, you can't address it through a justice lens, right? So it is that process of saying, what are the different ways we can learn from different forms of theoretical frameworks, but also different action, like who's doing what. So do we want to look at, for instance, the feminist Green New Deal? Do you want to look at a different network or collective that's occurring in, let's say, Latin America or maybe Southeast Asia, or that's even occurring in parts of Africa, right? There's people often conflate indigenous to only exist in settler colonial contexts, and that's entirely not true. There are indigenous communities around the world. So if you look at some of the work that's being done by indigenous scientists in Africa and how climate has been talked about, how it's understood, how it's explained in the community, and how it forms not only just a part of folklore, but is very accurate to current day climate models. So, so there are different ways we can start to show that what we understand in that kind of Cartesian, that dualistic, Eurocentric knowledge isn't the only knowledge in the world. And that helps us to also therefore think about education as caregiving in terms of generations before us, generations to come, but after us, and then also that spatial sense of networking. So I think education is a really important site at which we can start to have these kinds of conversations, because climate education is very needed, but it cannot be just prescriptive in higher education or K through 12. We're seeing it more in higher education than we're seeing it in K through 12 in the US at least. So I really think from kindergarten through high school, so before higher education, that is where climate education needs to definitely go up, but also in terms of public education, right? In terms of learning from communities, having conversations with communities. I mean, this is where I think journalists play a really critical role, because you're often the first source, like a media source, whether they're getting your information from a media app or from TikTok, right? It varies. So the point is to get the information out there, because you're also playing a very critically important role in educating people.
Yes, and I think that we also need an appointment of the government and state about this issue, because we think I think that the work here is like to bring these issues, the climate issues, to the curriculum of the universities and the schools, yes. And this is the role that the governments and states need to face. And I think our job as our work as journalists and communicators and media activists and and citizens are like to put pressure on them, yeah, because it's very important that we discuss it in the schools and the universities. And yes, but we need to do it in a high scale. That is the power of the state and governments, yes.
Yeah, we're getting close to the end in terms of time here, and I appreciate so many of you sticking with us. I mean, there's maybe a good segue here. There's a question from Megan Rowling at Thomson Reuters Foundation, and says that they're working on boosting their coverage of climate change and labor rights and just transition. And she's in charge of that. But she's asking to hear more about what our plans are to support journalists' work on this topic, especially in the Global South. So maybe, Christine, do you want to share a little bit about where we are and where people can find out more about putting proposals in, either the journalists who are on this call or journalists to make sure they're aware of this?
I'd love to. Thank you, John. We are very excited about this. This is the launch of Your Work Environment. And the process, and I know this both as a grantee and somebody who is helping Pulitzer right now, the process is very straightforward. You go on the site, you look to apply for a grant, you can see the initiatives. We now have a section for the Climate Labor Initiative, Your Work Environment. And there's an application process. I think it's fairly simple and straightforward. You have a proposal. You have 250 words. You can go over that. It's just we're trying to force you to be as succinct and clear as possible. Have an idea for one story, two stories, whether it's video or text. I saw some people were saying in the comments, don't forget print. That's important. We don't forget print, but we know that many people get their information and want to watch videos. So we're open to that. We're open to very innovative, thoughtful ways to inform across generations. The more platforms you can think of, the more excited we get. You have to, and it's very important to have some media outlet in mind. And part of the process is that you have a firm commitment before we give the money. It's fine to say you're exploring it when you first apply, but it would be better to know that that editor says that reporter's good, I'm going to publish it in whatever form if it's available. And also budgeting. I've worked in TV and I've worked in print and I've managed bureaus in Baghdad. You need to know your budget, and you are in the region and you will know what the cost of a translator, if you need a translator per day, the cost of a hotel per day. Don't tell me you're going to go for a month and explore something. Tell me how many days, when, and what the cost is per day for your project. And remember, you might want to do a video, but you need to understand the cost of editing and broadcast and who's going to put it up on their website or put it on their TV channel or broadcast channel. So I do want to, because as a grantee, I believe the Pulitzer Center tries to get to yes. The more specific you can be, the more helpful people will be in saying, well, this seems like a worthy story. You might not know quite how to frame it in the application. People are here to help you. We hope to get 10 to 15 projects this year, and then we will have a second year, even more projects. So if you have any questions, contact at pulitzercenter.org. That is the portal that will always take your questions, and we can respond to that.
So I just add just a couple of points to that, Christine. The one I mentioned at the beginning that this initiative, we have support from the Loudest Foundation, which is a Dutch-based foundation, and we're extremely grateful for that. It's a 2-year initiative, and in this work, as in all the work that the Pulitzer Center does, we go out and we try to raise money from foundations and individuals always with the understanding that there is no editorial control, that it's the editorial responsibility is left with us and really with the journalists we fund and the outlets that they work with. That's the model of the Pulitzer Center. And we think it's a really important model so that you don't have individual journalists and outlets feeling beholden to any donor, any foundation, any individual, no matter how well-intentioned they might be. So that's important. But we also think that we can fill a really important gap here if we all kind of work together and take advantage of these opportunities. As I say, it's we have a sort of 2-year runway for this, and if we come up with lots of exciting and impactful work, I'm quite sure we can raise additional resources and be a venue, a platform, a conduit for sustaining a lot more of this kind of work. So take advantage of it and come to us with your ideas. As Christine said, we're interested in, if you've got a graphic novel style approach, that's great. An animated approach, a podcast, and we love collaborations. We love sort of cross-border projects that do the kind of comparative type reporting that lets you, bring different points of view into your reporting. But we're also very open to a proposal from one journalist or one outlet. So we're wide open. It's really just how original it is, what we think the impact might be, and how realistic we think the budget is. And in terms of on the website, we say that these grants that we're looking at, we're anticipating that most of them will be in the kind of $10,000 to $25,000 range, but we can definitely go below or above that, depending on how elaborate the project might be, how much travel is involved, how much media is involved. So don't take that as a constraint to just come to us with the ideas, and we'll get back to you. One of the other advantages of what we think is a great strength of our model is that we meet every Wednesday. Christine, we're going into a meeting right now as soon as we finish this call, where we look at the proposals that came in over the last week. And typically we're looking at 15 or 20, no more than that each week for the most part. And we often end up funding 5 or 6 of those. So your odds are really good, much better than you think. This is not the kind of situation where it's a once-a-year competition and we're going to give 5 grants out of 1,000 applicants, where it really does feel like you're just putting in a lottery ticket. This is quite different. And if we think there is strength and merit in the proposal, but it's lacking some things from our point of view, you're going to hear from Christina, one of our other editors, and who will help you go through and make it a stronger proposal and make it fundable. So work with us. I think that if we do that, we all do this together, we really can bring this incredibly important new dimension and urgency to the kind of coverage that we're doing on climate.
Just to follow up, one Seema Prasad has asked, how important is the letter from an editor for okaying the budget? It's pretty important. We need to know that you have a media outlet, and there's another question asking about local media. We're very happy if you, from one place to another, can figure out how to have a local person. If you're from another country, a Western country, you're going to be working locally, and you bring that reporter in or cameraman in or whoever you bring in, that's great with us. But we do want to see that, we're just not giving money to do something that may see publication. We want impact, and we want to help inform the public. So that's important. It is,
it's super important. But on the other hand, we will, if you come to us and you don't have those contacts, but your proposal knocks our socks off, then if it's something that we think we can pitch, then we may get back. So it's worth a shot. But in general, what Chris says is absolutely right. That the more you help us see that this will have legs, this will have impact, the better.
Can I add just one thing? I saw today the FT is a BAFTA finalist for a journalistic video that they did. And we are so interested in new platforms and new ways of making people think about climate. So write a play. Talk to us about it.
We have funded plays on a range of different issues. We have one that's touring the country this summer. So yes, we're totally open to that. And one last thing before we close, Holly, I think is it possible we can save this chat? There's been a huge, great conversation going on in the chat here. There are a lot of suggestions and good resources. So I think that's something that we can save and make available. Am I right, Holly?
Sorry, could you repeat that, John?
I said asking about saving the chat so that we can make that available if people are interested.
Yeah, we can save the chat. We will be posting the recording on our website, and we can send the chat to everyone who is here today.
That'd be great. Okay, I think that would be helpful to lots of folks who are on the call. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all for being with us. This has been fascinating to me, and I hope to all of you, and I look forward to, we all look forward to hearing from you.